Sasha is a researcher at Mila AI Institute in Montreal, where she works on AI for humanity projects spanning from climate change to bias detection. She received her PhD in 2017 in cognitive computing, after which she spent several years working in applied AI research. And in 2019, she left her job in finance to pursue her passion at Mila. She serves on several committees, including Climate Change AI and Women in Machine Learning. I do want to thank Sasha for spending some time with us this morning and for joining this conversation.
What is AI for good anyway? Just a little bit of context. As Andrew mentioned, there's been a lot of AI for good buzz. Tech companies have AI for good programs. Smaller companies as well, universities have all been looking into AI for good. There's also, smaller scale, larger scale initiatives. And the general goal of all these initiatives is essentially to deploy the best, most cutting edge AI and to solve critical problems. So these can be poverty, hunger, crime, health. And I've been kind of basking in this for the last couple of years. And a question came to mind, about 6 months ago. I really started thinking about this. What makes AI good? So is it the domain of application? So is any, for example, health application of AI good? Is any application of AI in education or environment good intrinsically? Is it the problem being solved? Is it the fact that we predict a natural disaster or detect cancer? Is that what makes AI good? Is it the positive impact? So is AI for Good project particularly good because it can impact thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people? Is this what really we're going towards? Or is it the intention? As Andrew mentioned, often projects have the intention to do good, and is that all it takes, and the rest is kind of secondary? Or is it all of the above? So I've been thinking about this a lot, and since I'm a researcher, I've started doing some research. I've read a lot of papers. I've watched a lot of talks. Here are some of the people I've been particularly listening to in the last months because they have really important things to say. And then I prepared this talk for you because I think that you can really benefit from this kind of more holistic vision of AI for good in your future projects and endeavors. And I will intertwine some thoughts from these great leaders, these great researchers, in order to kind of guide all of us towards hopefully a common definition of AI for good, hopefully some principles that we can follow, or at least some things that we can keep in mind when we strive to do AI for good, because I know this is something that interests all of us. So to start with Lester Mackey, he says AI holds the potential to help us address some of our biggest challenges like poverty, food scarcity, and climate change. And I completely agree with that. But let me start with some success stories, some projects that for me really hit a home run in terms of using AI for good. There's Lester Mackey's group actually at Stanford who called Statistics for Social Good, and they have this really great bottom-up strategy. So essentially they divide and conquer. So they contact different stakeholders, national, international. They reach out to them. They ask, how can we help you? How can we use statistics or AI to help you? They distill the problem. They try to figure out what technology can be used. They figure out the data that's there. Essentially, they do all this kind of legwork in order to define these projects, and then they deploy them along with relevant stakeholders. And they document all of their findings on the website. So for me, this is a really great approach. It's very bottom up, but it works really well. They've had some very, very impactful projects. You can check them out if you want. Stats for Good at stanford.edu. So this is one way of doing it. Another way of doing it as the Computational Sustainability Network with Carla Gomez, they do it in the opposite way. They go with the techniques that they master, for example, stochastic inference, sequential decision making, pattern decomposition. So they start with really the things that they do well as AI researchers who are interested in sustainability. And they see how they can use these techniques. This is actually a subway map of all the different projects they work on, which is great because it shows that some projects need only one technique that's enough to do, for example, plant phenotyping. But other ones need several techniques working together. So impacts of dams in the Amazon needs a lot of different techniques. Bike sharing also needs 4 different approaches. So they really have a more top-down approach. So they start with what they know they can do, and then go down. So this is interesting because it's actually really complementary to Lester's work. A very recent success story for me in AI for Good has been Michaela van der Schaar's group in the UK. What's interesting in this case is that they took a tool that they developed for other applications before, for essentially for hospital decision making, and they deployed it for COVID-19. So what they did is they created a tool for NHS, so that's the UK health authority. They developed a tool that for administrators and doctors and hospitals to predict essentially the severity of their patients. So based on different criteria, age, sex, comorbidities, et cetera, it's to help essentially decision makers decide whether, to allocate an ICU bed, whether they need an intubator, a ventilator or not. Sorry. So essentially, it's really like a tool for them to get hands-on decision making. And what's really interesting is that this was deployed super fast because essentially they took something that they created for other diseases that were more slow-moving, cancer and et cetera, and then they really deployed it in a very quick turnaround time in the UK. And they did it in partnership with the NHS, making sure that they developed in a way that they could deploy it in hospitals without having this huge learning curve. And it actually is used right now, and it has potential to save thousands or tens of thousands of lives. So once again, huge success story. But as another one of the researchers I've been looking into says, while AI for Good programs often warrant genuine excitement, so I'm genuinely excited about this work, they should invite increased scrutiny. Good intentions are not enough when it comes to deploying AI for those in the greatest need. So on the flip side of the coin, we've looked at these great success stories, but what are some cautionary tales that we can look at to see what can potentially go wrong even when good intentions are at play, and AI for Good is the objective. So AI for Good can have unintended consequences. Maybe all of you know at this point the Compass project in the US. I think the intention was really great, was to try to alleviate some of the pressure on the judicial system in the US and to try to predict essentially what some of the people who are sentenced currently, whether or not they have a probability of committing crimes in the future. Now, it was trained on all sorts of data, on historical data, and a ProPublica research project that analyzed it realized that most of the features that were used for this kind of prediction was actually race. So African American inmates were seen as more likely to commit crimes in the future. So obviously not good, right? And this was a system that was actually deployed and used in courtrooms all across the country. So this is a cautionary tale of intentions are there, but obviously the way it was done was not the way that benefited the most people. Another example is more recent, actually. This happened a few months ago in August. Because of COVID in the UK, once again, they had to cancel final exams for high school students, so for people who were going to university. And since they had to cancel these exams, they thought, okay, we'll train a machine learning algorithm to predict results instead of actually having kids pass tests. And they had, once again, several features, and notably the historical notes of the student themselves and of their school. So these were the two main criteria used, and essentially they attributed marks to students, and based on these marks, they could go or not to university. So, massive decision, and huge bias, because good students in less good schools with less academic excellence were heavily penalized versus mediocre students from very excellent schools who had this unfair advantage, right? And so it created a lot of noise in the UK. Finally, they went back and questioned their decision, but once again, great intention. They wanted to make sure that the stress of COVID was not amplified by these exams. Another cautionary tale. Finally, there was a system meant for detecting poachers in Africa in wildlife reserves, and it was deployed. It was working more or less, but they figured out that kind of the problems that have been identified in out-of-the-box facial recognition algorithms, that they don't work very well when it's dark, and often they don't work very well on darker skin tones, were amplified in this poaching detection system, so it had a lot of false positives. And often it was very hard to justify a false positive. Like if someone was falsely accused, it was hard for them to say, no, I'm not a poacher, I was just there, or because they didn't know what the decision, what the features used for the algorithm were. So they just know that this person was classified as a poacher. So the local authorities have this kind of they have a label that this person is a poacher without any kind of explanation of the decision made. And so the person accused couldn't really justify themselves. And so finally it was put on hold for the moment. They're working on improving it. But, you know, once again, great intention. The way that it was deployed, maybe a little less successful. And nowadays, we have all these AI algorithms that detect, that track biodiversity, that predict how whether or not we're a good fit for a position that we apply to. Nowadays, for example, they can diagnose COVID based on X-rays, right, in hospitals, and poaching as well. So we have all these kind of these systems that are deployed in various areas that make decisions or that propose decisions, predict things, and we don't really know how this happens. And so often also AI for good projects attract a lot of attention, a lot of positive buzz kind of, and then less so for the actual impact. So there's less follow through. So we hear about these great projects, groundbreaking, you know, climate change, poverty, etc. But then what happens? You know, what's the actual impact? So there's kind of two use cases for me. Sometimes in the best case, we see AI as this magical fairy dust for positive impact, which, you know, arguably can be good for the domain, but there's no concrete, without solving any concrete problems. So we see this AI as like a, you know, a savior of the humanity, but after that, there's no follow through. So this is kind of for me the best case. And in the worst case, we're using AI to experiment on vulnerable populations and without giving them any benefits of the technology. So for example, if we do have, you know, false positives, if we do have these kinds of algorithmic decision making. So for example, if someone does get sent back to prison because some AI told the judge that they're more likely to recommit a crime, that's huge. That can be someone's life. That can be someone's, you know, whole livelihood. They get sent back to prison. That's 20 years of their life gone. And so in this case, we have to really be careful when we deploy AI. So this is kind of the horizon, but how can we make AI for good better? And this is what I'm really here to talk to you about. We can start with asking the right questions. So Timna Gebru is a researcher in AI and ethics, and she says we need to figure out, are we asking the right research questions? What are the pitfalls? Because then AI has hopes of being more impactful. So what are the right questions? Well, let's start with what the problem is. So I think that many AI for good projects define a problem that's not necessarily the real problem that they're trying to solve. So often, you know, we're tackling climate change, we're solving poverty, we're reducing crime. This is the real problem, right? This is what we're aiming towards. But we solve a proxy problem. So for example, detecting poverty from satellite imagery, identifying extreme weather events based on, you know, radar, facial recognition for poaching. These are kind of proxy problems because it's not necessarily going to stop climate change to identify like a hurricane. It definitely is going to help something, but it's not necessarily going to, you know, stop climate change. Detecting poverty based on a satellite image, it's, you know, arguably good to know where there are poor areas, but is it really helping solve poverty? And once again, with a crime, what's the problem we're solving? Just predicting whether someone is more likely to commit a crime based on data of people who have been stopped, and so that data can be biased as well. So honestly, it's really a proxy problem that doesn't address actual, you know, reducing crime. And often we don't have any solid data, so we use surrogate data from, you know, either other places or based on some older historical trends. Like for example, for poverty detection, it can be, you know, some census data from 10 years ago. It can be just based on average income. It can be lots of things. Aggregate data often is high-level data, and this is what we use for deploying the projects. So you can see the problem. Are we sure that the solutions are really similar in both cases? Are we sure that the surrogate problem has the same solution as the real problem? I'm not sure. And often AI is touted as the solution because it's great. AI, you know, can do lots of stuff. We've got all these deep neural networks. It's amazing. But is it really the right solution for the problem at hand? Say you do figure out the problem that you want to solve. Is AI really the solution? So often AI solutions are actually really complex and expensive to develop, very technologically demanding, hard to deploy. Often it's, you know, you deploy it, for example, on the cloud or in your own servers, and it's used by people on the ground. They don't have access to the actual algorithm. They don't really understand what's going on. They just have some kind of, okay, this is good, this is bad. But there's a very big gap between people who develop the problems, the solutions, and the people who actually need to use the technology. And also, you know, constraints. Do they have the technology in order to actually visualize something? Do they even have computers that are powerful enough to run these machines in the context that you're aiming for? And often people jump to AI before trying simpler solutions. You know, maybe some a statistical, more simple random forest approach can be used. Maybe it can even just be a pure, you know, something like textual analysis, maybe just like keyword search instead of convolutional neural networks. I mean, there's a huge gap before you can jump into training a deep neural network from scratch. And as I said, AI for Good initiatives, I believe that they're truly well-intentioned, but they raise some important questions that often don't get covered in enough depth. So, for example, who defines the problem to be solved? Is it the AI researcher? Is it the company they work for? Or is it the people who are going to be using this eventual tool? Is AI the right solution for this problem, or is it just because, you know, we've got a convolutional neural network lying handy and we want to use it on something, so this is why we're using AI? Where does the data come from? What metrics are used for measuring progress? Is it, you know, is it accuracy? Is it a F1 score, which, for example, will track false positives and false negatives? Are you sure that you're tracking your progress in the way that makes sense with regards to the situation? Who will use the solution proposed? Who will maintain the technology, right? There's all these questions that have to be thought through before even starting a project, before even training a neural network. These are all really important things to take into account. And also, finally, who will make the ultimate decision? Is it the algorithm or is it a human? And if it's both of them, how is that decision made? How is the decision explained, for example, in terms of transparency to a human who will use that information to make their decision? So, I mean, we have to think through all these questions before doing AI for good. Another aspect, I don't know if you noticed all of the initiatives, I said it at the beginning of my talk, they're really hand in hand with stakeholders on the ground. The NHS, it can be you know, all the different organizations that Stanford worked with. Computational Sustainability Network also often always work with the partners on the field, so including the right people. And here I can turn to a quote from Shakir Mohammed, who also works in ethical AI, who says, "The only AI that empowers and works for the benefit of humanity is truly global AI, and making AI truly global will not be easy." And so it's true that it's complicated to work with stakeholders who often don't really understand the technology, who don't have the background necessary for understanding the algorithm itself, right? So we really need to change the way we talk. We can't just use technical terms anymore, but it's really, really super important. So on one hand, NGOs, for example, if you're working with Red Cross or UNICEF, Médecins Sans Frontières, they have real-world expertise on global problems. They'll tell you what the problem is. They'll literally say, you know, whatever, you know, toy data set you're using, that doesn't have nothing to do with what we're actually facing out there in the field. So they can really tell you the problem that you need to solve. They can also help deploy the AI solutions so that they have the biggest impact. And actually, like in a lot of countries, populations trust organizations like the Red Cross, sometimes more than local governments, because they've been there for a really long time. They've proven time and time again that, you know, they can get medicine, they can have outreach or educational programs. So people really trust these organizations, and working with them gives an immense amount of credibility to any AI for Good project. And they can also give you feedback about your AI, because say you train a model that does some kind of prediction or classification, and you get 99% accuracy on your data set, and then you give it to, for example, the Red Cross, and they're like, wait, this doesn't work. This is not the categories that we have in real life. It's not just black and white. There's also like 20 shades of gray between the two. Maybe we should be looking at a multi-class classification problem and not a binary classification problem. I mean, those are probably not the terms they're going to be using, but this is the feedback that you're going to get, and you can go back to the drawing board and retrain your algorithm. Also, an important part of this is actually empowering the people who will use the AI, because if there's a big gap between, you know, these kind of AI geniuses, these AI wizards that develop this technology, and the people who, you know, will just kind of get it and have to use it, there's a big gap there that's not necessarily, doesn't build trust, doesn't build, you know, cohesion. So it's really important to include and empower the stakeholders and the populations who will use this AI technology. And this should be done from square one, like when you, instead of, you know, training a version of your algorithm and then going to the Red Cross and then saying, hey, I can predict, you know, blah, blah, blah. I can predict whether someone's going to go get their vaccine or not. And then maybe you should go back to the drawing board and ask them, you know, do you need to predict whether people are going to go in for vaccines? Or is there another problem that's more important? Maybe it's the way of getting the vaccines to the villages that's really the real problem, because people are willing, but they're not willing to go 50 kilometers in order to get it. You know, there's all these problems that maybe are something that we didn't really think of. And actually, the problem with that is that most of AI comes from Western hubs, right? What do we know about getting vaccines in a rural country across the world from us? We don't know that. We can pretend to know. We can even read some articles and say, hey, BBC says this is an issue. And maybe it is, maybe it truly is, but maybe there's a bigger issue in the region that you're looking at or with a specific NGO that you're looking at. And we have to make sure that we're not the ones that are imposing our view of AI on other populations. And so we have to be inclusive and engage voices, cultures, and ideas from places that we don't necessarily have contact with in our daily lives. So it's really a big effort, actually, to go and to kind of find the right people to build a relationship of trust, to really keep the conversation going, and to explain what you're doing to non-specialists. This is something that I've been working on cultivating for a while now, because I realized that the way I talk about my science, about my research, doesn't percolate, doesn't really hit the way I want the people I'm talking to. And so I've started to simplify the way I talk about AI. I've started to use more, less sciencey terms, more less math or less statistics, and more kind of real world language that people can really get behind. And in order to include people and create an inclusive AI, we all need to be talking like this about our work, even though it's really hard. And finally, I mentioned this briefly, but AI for good projects are rarely a one-shot deal. You're not going to solve poverty with a single AI algorithm. It's usually one piece of a puzzle, and most of the other pieces of the puzzle are not going to be AI. They're going to be other things. They're going to be things like outreach, like decision making, policy making. They're going to be convincing people that this is the solution to be used. So it's really important to think about the big picture, and about domain knowledge, because yeah, sure, we're the AI scientists, but we need to ensure that our algorithms are functioning properly and own them in a way that they can be used. And so committing time and effort for maintaining deployed AI for good projects on our end is really important to ensure their perennity. And maybe like you've trained your algorithm, it's great, it solves the problem that you need, it works well, et cetera, but then people are hesitant to use it because they don't understand how the decision is being made. So it's up to you to work on making it more transparent and more explainable, so that people can really get a grasp of what it is, what kind of algorithm is making a decision that will impact their lives. And this brings me to the last principle. It's being transparent. So being transparent about your algorithm, about the way it works, about the solution you've developed, the features that it's using, all of that. And Joy Buolamwini is an amazing researcher. She works a lot on the intersection between actually art, AI, and kind of governments and policy making. And she says, as companies, governments, and law enforcement agencies use AI to make decisions about our opportunities and freedoms, we must demand that we are respected as a people. And for me, transparency is the foundation of respect for anyone, for it could be personal relationships, professional relationships. For me, from square one, you need to be transparent. And so what does that mean? That means that we should be clear about the risks and the benefits of the AI solutions. We shouldn't be saying that, hey, we made this magic potion that's going to solve all our problems. No, it has risks. There's always risks. And for example, I was very, very happy to see that NeurIPS, which is one of the major AI conferences, starting this year, they made it mandatory for AI researchers to submit a statement about the societal impacts of their work. And that's major, because even if you're working on a classification approach or some theoretical AI algorithm, it's important to think about down the line how this can impact society. So we should think about both the benefits and the risks of the approaches we develop, both in the short and the long term, because for sure, if you're creating some new loss function, it's easy to say, but this is just a local thing, it's not going to really impact, but maybe that's in the short term. But then if you use that loss function in the real world, it can have real world impacts in the long term. And when promotion of the project is done, when you say, hey, when your company says, well, we did an AI for good project, we're going to tackle climate change, we're going to solve poverty, well, they should be pretty clear. You should be pretty clear about the scope and the limitations of your project. It shouldn't be, no one's going to solve that big a problem with a small algorithm. You have to say, we have a data sample from here, we have partners from there, this is the scope of our project, and be very clear about the fact that it's not going to cure cancer. And one of, for example, the aspects that Joy works in is checking for bias. And so she did this amazing project called Gender Shades about the about how biased facial recognition technology is. And that's kind of the tip of the iceberg, because it's in everything. In any algorithm, there's going to be bias, and we just have to be transparent about it and understand what's going on. So this involves checking the data that the model was trained on. Is it balanced? Is it representative? Who labeled the data? Is it experts, or is it crowdsourced for people who don't really understand what the problem is? I mean, again, using Mechanical Turk can be great if you want to label a bunch of data, but often you don't explain the task at hand. It's just kind of a simplified version of the task to simplify the labeling process. But is that really representative if it's a complex task? Does the model do equally well in all categories? Darker skin tones, men and women. So these are things that need to be tested before deployment to make sure that you're not inadvertently causing harm and kind of discrimination. Also, what are the features used? So often, when we train a deep neural network, it's really hard to say this is the feature that makes the prediction the way the system predicts the way it does, right? It's often not one single thing. It's a multitude of things. But we should be working to make our algorithms more explainable. So you can say it's 50% this, 30% that, et cetera, et cetera. So at least you know that the features being used are relevant to the task at hand. Or is it using features that shouldn't be used in this particular context because a neural network does not know, that you shouldn't use, for example, skin color to predict crime. You can't tell an AI that is not a feature. It's up to us as people, as researchers, to add that constraint into the algorithm and to have the checks and balances to make sure we're not using those kinds of features. Also, what happens with false positives? What happens if someone does get accused of, being likely to recommit a crime? Are they assumed guilty until proven innocent? Because that's kind of what was happening with Compass when the ProPublica article came out. There was no second guessing. There was no check and balance there for false positives, and that's major. And also, who makes the final decision? So I'm a big fan of human-in-the-loop AI because I feel that we're not there yet to deploy AI systems that are just going to go off and make decisions about human lives. I think it could be a data point, and sometimes it's an important data point, but it shouldn't be, the only data point we're using to judge whether someone should spend a life in prison. It shouldn't be that straightforward. So I think it's important to kind of create a balance between decision-making, algorithmic decision-making, and human decision-making. And so the takeaway messages that I want you to kind of keep in your mind is when you're doing AI for good projects, good intentions for me are a given, but it's also often important to ask the right questions, include the right people, and to be transparent. And kind of a quote that really stayed in the back of my mind, again from Mark Latonero, is he says that the deeper issue is that no massive societal problem can be reduced to the solution offered by the smartest corporate technologists partnering with the most venerable international organizations. So even if you do, check all the boxes, just keep in the back of your mind that it's really hard to solve climate change or, tackle poverty with AI. It takes so much more than that. And so this is why it's so important to have a more holistic vision and to think kind of outside the AI box. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sasha. That was very insightful, and I love that last quote. We're seeing that so much in the different projects that we're XPRIZE or that AI for Good are promoting here and sponsoring, that need for inclusion of all different skill sets to address a problem. So we have some time here for some Q&A. So I open up. I see we have a few questions that come in through the chat. So I welcome anybody to ask some more of those questions. I'll get the process started here, kicking off with a couple questions here that have come through. We'll start with. I mean, you've talked in your presentation a number of different recommendations or principles around how we attack these AI for Good projects and avoid some of the pitfalls of them. Any ideas on how we could possibly enforce that, we as a collective community?
I think that it's important to have frameworks. So actually I think right now these kinds of frameworks are being developed for AI in general, but it's also still a work in progress. So how do you, make sure an AI is not biased? And so I think that we can really piggyback on that process for AI for Good. So while these discussions are being had, to make sure that the AI for Good use cases are being taken into account. So for example, areas like health, areas like poverty, like climate change, so that we're really taking into account the specificities of these areas, and that the discourse doesn't get dominated by financial decision making and things like that. So having a seat at the table and being clear about the specificities and like why are AI for good projects, why should they be part of the discussion? Why should we be focusing on them? We have started to see principles of ethical AI. For example, we've got the Montreal Declaration, etc. But they're not like a checklist. I think what it really would take is to have a kind of a really something that you can use systematically when you're deploying an AI project, so you know that it's not just being transparent, it's ensuring that the features are accessible to, for example, a person using the algorithm. So it's really concrete steps that are part of a broader principle.
Excellent. Great. Thank you for that. Next question that came through the chat was kind of referring back to the beginning of your presentation, and the question is as follows: with all your comments about AI, the quote AI for good buzz all over the place, is there a risk of AI for good washing, or worse, is this already happening? Therefore, putting off potential serious partners and funders. What's needed to cut this risk short?
I definitely think it's happening. I think that, I see a lot of events that are like tech for good, and it's like finance, and then it's like, AI for good, and it's just, convolutional neural networks. And I see a lot of that happening. And I think, of course, there's going to be hype. I think that that's kind of, that's where AI is at right now. We're at this, I think this is kind of like the new awakening with regards to the limitations of AI. I think more and more we're going to realize that AI can't do this, AI can't do that, and keeping the discourse centered on projects that are real and are impactful, and so leading by example essentially, because you can't go on and keep telling people, no, that's not AI for good, no, your event's not tech for good, right? But you can lead by example, and you can deploy projects that really put their money where their mouth is. And so I think this is up to us to say, okay, like I followed, all the best practices. I deployed these projects. Now I can safely say that my project is AI for good and promote it, knowing that it's really impactful.
I love that. Hopefully we've got a few projects here that we'll be talking about later that fall into that category of really showing what we can deliver. Next question, specific, and this relates to what you were talking about earlier about the enforcing the principles, but maybe focusing on a certain audience of that. Specifically in the case of big companies who have big budgets and talent pools, it seems to be really important that they're aware of all the things that you're talking about here, i.e. proxy problems versus real problems. So how can they frame all that involvement under ethical considerations and fiduciary duty so as to protect the most vulnerable populations? So
this is something I've been grappling with myself. So I've always kind of stuck to being in research and academia, and it's true that it's easier. Things seem clear from the ivory tower, but when you do get into the nuts and bolts of it, it's a lot harder than you think. And so, for example, even asking the right questions, it's really hard once you get to the real, like the real work. And so I think that in big companies, what's important is to kind of work with academics, work with people who maybe are a bit naive. Maybe I'm a bit naive, I totally accept that. But so, big companies have their own ways of doing things. They have their own, limitations. They have their own things that they're trying to maximize or minimize, et cetera, et cetera. But by creating partnerships between research and academia, I think we're all kind of getting pulled in the opposite directions of where we have a tendency to gravitate. So researchers like it when, the data is clean, the project is well defined, et cetera, and we know exactly how to solve it. In the real world, it's never like that, and so some corners can be cut just because the real world is a lot messier. But if we really work together and connect research and industry, I think that's where the potential is.
I love that linkage. That makes a lot of sense. Next question, and I'll put a little spin on it. The question was, how can AI systems be audited to assert if they are, quote, AI for good or not? Or I know that's a large question, but maybe have you seen attempts where there have been attempts to give a scorecard or what have you to implementations as to whether or not they meet that bill?
So I haven't seen an AI for good scorecard, but I've definitely seen an ethics and bias scorecard. It's interesting because it actually entails a lot of things. Because in order to say something meets the criteria or not, we have to define the criteria, and so far we haven't systematically defined the criteria. So, but there have been, for example, I've seen consultancies and even, for example, legal practitioners doing some kind of like AI audits, and of course big consulting companies as well. So I think that it's really, instead of trying to audit, we should be working towards some kind of ISO certification of AI. I think that would be a very good direction to take, even though it's kind of wishful thinking, but just having a way of certifying an AI system, even based on a limited amount of criteria, would definitely help everyone, because we have a way of certifying bridges, of certifying airplanes, of certifying lots of things, but not a facial recognition algorithm. And so, and we can, in that case, like if we think more programmatically, we can have unit tests, right? We can say, okay, we're going to run your facial recognition algorithm through these tests and make sure it has the same score on, dark skin and light skin, on men and on women, at night and during the day. So you can have these kind of checks and balances once you define the criteria that you're optimizing for. So I think we should take a step back and focus on that. And once we've defined those criteria, then we can start auditing and giving scores.
Makes a lot of sense. Hopefully we've got some folks around in the audience here that could participate in that kind of activity.
Yeah.
Then we had a few questions coming in through the globalization of AI in terms of, one which is maybe two lenses to look at it, some of the challenges, particularly, if we can't come to agreements on political issues or, privacy issues, whatever, between, say, U.S. and China, how could we incentivize or come to a similar type of agreement around AI? And that's kind of part one. Part two, a follow-on question to that is, are there examples where there is good examples of globalization, where different AI projects or initiatives have gotten together to leverage each other's work product to increase the scope?
So actually, I don't know of any existing initiatives. I think it would be useful. Most of the initiatives are pretty regional, or sometimes, one institution that is on one continent that is deploying in another continent. But in order to be global, I think, actually, I can send the ball back to your court, we need an international organization that will federate this. And I think that ITU and other UN organizations they already have part of that know-how, right? Because we don't necessarily have it as researchers. Private companies don't necessarily have it, but these kinds of organizations that have a history and a baggage can really be the federators. And they could really make the connections and ensure that things are done in a correct way to prevent, bias, to prevent, developing AI applications that can't be deployed in the field. So honestly, I see them as the hub of making these initiatives. So, but I don't know of any existing ones so far.
Well, I guess that's a challenge for us to put those together.
Exactly.
Next question reads as follows. What about already present problems that AI only laid bare? Bias and discrimination are prevalent in topics like recruitment or crime fighting. When AI is applied to these areas, these issues drift to the surface because suddenly we have the data. So we blame the AI for being biased. Isn't that blaming of the technology? Aren't we blaming the technology for a human problem?
For sure. And I think that what, for example, the Compass project brought to light is that the judiciary system is biased. It's not the AI. Obviously, the AI is just trained based on the data. And for example, ProPublica was saying that, most of the people who do get rearrested are African Americans because there's a bias in the policing system. And so, it's like a transfer of bias that percolates up. What I think is interesting about AI is that it can make us realize our own biases. So, for example, there's a really interesting project by MIT called the Moral Machine, and there's all these dilemmas around self-driving cars, autonomous driving. Do we go right and hit an elderly person, or go left and hit a baby in a pram? So which choices are okay? And the answer is that there is no good choice, right? And they made an interesting website where you can answer a bunch of questions as if you were the autonomous vehicle. So do you choose the grandma or the baby? And then at the end, it gives you a scorecard of your own biases. And it's interesting because every person who has done that, in my experience, are like, no, I'm not biased against old people. No, I'm not like that. And then you can see how biased people are. All the people who took that test are, and then. So the answer to autonomous vehicle ethics is that there is no right answer, and we just have to be clear about the features that we're using to make those decisions. And I think that's where explainable AI and transparent AI really come into the loop, because of course we're not going to make 100% unbiased AI, But if we can show to a human what are the features being used to make this decision, then we can at least make it part of the equation. Okay, the algorithm says 90% this, but it's based on these features which are acceptable or not given the problem, and that's up to us.
Yep. Thank you for that. It makes perfect sense. Next question. You talked about transparency. I think some of the audience wanted some further clarity around transparency. Is this to do with the data or something other?
So there's different approaches to transparency. It's actually really interesting. There are approaches that really have to do with the data, but often it's the way we represent the data. So what kind of features are we using? So what are the features that we're allowing the system to use to make the decisions? And so now more and more there are systems that you can kind of, for example, there's a system called What If, where you load your data and then you have your task is where you want to predict, whatever, category A, category B. And you train your neural network and it gives it the output, and then the system shows you what would happen if you remove this category. If you remove this category, what would happen not only in the accuracy of the model, but in how well it's doing to represent both classes, for example. So say your initial accuracy was super high, but the minority class, it was really bad, and there was a lot of false negatives or false positives. And then you can see, like, you can uncheck a box and you can say, okay, don't use this feature anymore. And then you can see what happens if that feature is not present anymore. And you can even have proxy features. You can have a feature that represents both, race and gender. For example, in health, there's a researcher in University of Toronto who does really interesting work, because in health, you can't just ignore gender. You can't just say gender is not a feature in this data, because it's obviously important for a lot of things. Same thing with race, because there's actually some pre-existing genetic conditions that are a lot more prevalent in certain racial backgrounds than others. So she says you can't just ignore this, but you can anonymize the data. You can aggregate the data in a way that race is not the only feature being used. So I think that's really important, because you can't just pretend that all the uncomfortable features are not important. You can't just say, okay, let's just ignore all of these and make our decisions on other things, because then you're not using all of the data. So data is a massive part of the problem.
So that's actually, we had questions along the same lines there. First, just one was the role of data in AI for good. So in the grand scheme of things, how much we should focus on the data element to it. And a related question that came along there was, could some global data commons be a useful solution? Is it the aggregation of those data sets, or is it more focus needs to be on removing the bias or cleaning or what have you of the data?
So getting the data is really major. For example, I'm part of an organization called Climate Change AI, and I'm actually, this is something we've been looking at. So say we have all these amazing machine learning researchers, AI researchers who want to solve climate change. Like, where is the data? And most of the data is in regional, kind of dispersed in different databases. Often it's in formats that are hard to read for machine learning, that you have to take a spreadsheet and convert it and things like that. So I think pooling data, having a data lake, would be a really massive part of the endeavor. Metadata is even a bigger part, because say you even do have all the data from all these different places, you have to make sure that it's interoperable, that you can use data for I don't know, droughts in this part of Africa with droughts in this part of Asia. Is it really the same criteria? Is it the same even the same units of measurement? Is it Celsius or Fahrenheit and things like that? So I think the geek in me really thinks that metadata is really important. If we had a system that could, AI could detect which fields are similar, which ones can be linked. So there's a massive engineering effort to be done, and a commons would be really useful, but it can't be just like everyone throws their data in and then we just pretend it's all, we can use all of it. There's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I think a certain ownership for that data that goes in there to ensure that the quality and the metadata, what have you, is key to that. We clearly have a lot of questions because you've got a lot of people interested here. So next one up, if you don't mind, you mentioned that we need to include more diverse voices and perspectives in order to ensure that AI projects are more effective and ethical. How do you think we can be more inclusive and listen to more diverse voices in developing AI projects going forward?
I think what I said about communicating is really important, and I'm definitely not perfect on this, but making sure that we talk about AI in a way that doesn't scare people off, because obviously people think that AI is only for crazy super math geniuses, or for people who can program, or for people who are rich, or whatever. People often have these prejudices, and part of this discussion should really be, AI is not magic. AI is just a way of computer learning based on things it's seen to predict things it hasn't seen. Like, I mean, talking about AI in a way that's like this, and also more representativity. So I think that once people realize that AI does not just belong to rich industrialized nations, that does not just belong to these huge companies with all this money, I think we definitely need more success stories that come from places of less money, less resources. So initiatives that are really kind of more grassroots, and that have been tracking locusts in the fields in their region, using a network that they downloaded from GitHub and that they retrained on pictures that they took, things like that. And the more we hear about these kinds of initiatives, the more people can own AI for good, and can understand that it's not just some white unindustrialized application. So I think we need to really promote projects that are not from the Western world and are not from the rich world.
I think, speaking on behalf of somebody who's been involved in the breakthrough tracks through this week, I think we've definitely seen that as a recurring theme, and fortunately had a lot of representation from across the world. So I think maybe making baby steps in that area, not quite there, but certainly progressing. A couple more here. Generally speaking, where do you see AI for good going in the future?
I think we're going to see this this dissemination. We're already starting to see the fact that there are more and more people owning AI. It's become more democratic, so more people can get involved in AI in general, right? So it doesn't take much to train a neural network. It doesn't take much to understand what the impact is. So I definitely see a democratization. And I think that more and more organizations that were hesitant to get involved are now getting involved. So, for example, in Montreal, we had a hackathon last year with some local NGOs, and then we had a lot of trouble getting data because essentially, for example, homeless shelters or soup kitchens, we wanted to help them use AI to help, for example, for the soup kitchen, it was to take the food they were getting and distribute it in a way, taking into account what food goes bad and what food doesn't. So, but we had a lot of trouble because they didn't really understand the value added. Like, they were like, why would we use AI if, we're having trouble, we're all hands on deck, we've got people lining up every day, like, what is this AI going to help us? But we did a first hackathon, we had, 3 or 4 data sets, and then this year, we're working on another one, and we have more people on board because they saw that we created a system that could be deployed in a soup kitchen that could predict, based on tomatoes and pasta, what could be made. And we really had fun with these projects, and so I think that more and more, once we get more product, people from the actual world getting on board, that's when we're going to see impact. Because so far it has been a bit of an ivory tower effect. So I'm really curious to see what happens when more people get involved and it becomes kind of this big babble of AI for good.
To that end, by the way, I mean, a big piece of what we've seen over this last week or so is really just sharing information about those types of projects as inspiration for future projects, or as projects for people to get involved in. We'll be talking about this later, but we do have a Slack channel for set up here. And somebody can maybe plug it in the chat, whereby people can connect around different projects. So love to give those projects a bit more of a voice, like I said, whether they're active ones to engage folks who are on the call, or whether they're just inspiration to create similar ones. And I think that's a good segue to what I'll make our last question here, which is really about this community that's on the meeting here. And so we have a community here, and if you could give them a call to action as to how can they get involved in AI for Good initiatives, what to look for, what inspiration would you have for them? Just please task them to join that fight.
Yeah, definitely. Step one for me is identifying what you're good at and how it can be used. So it doesn't have to be AI. Actually, I think a lot of the things around AI for Good projects that often get overlooked, things like I don't know, even, graphic design or communications journalism. If people are good at communicating, if it's a non-technical skill, it can actually bring a lot of value to AI for good projects. So above and beyond, so identify what you're good at, how it can be used. And there are actually a lot of initiatives once you start looking into it. Like if you search for your city and tech for good or some meetups and things like that, you'll be surprised that a lot of, especially larger cities, already have existing initiatives, and sometimes it can be a non-technical initiative. So for example, if you find volunteers who are working with a local NGO or a local soup kitchen or the government or whatever, see how AI or whatever skill you can leverage can help them. And so often, there's always something already there. So what I don't like about a lot of AI for good projects is they assume that they can just solve whatever issues at stake without doing the homework about how it's being solved now. Like, how is this being done by the people who are doing it without AI? So that would be the second step, doing your homework and figuring out how you fit into the puzzle. And maybe AI is not the solution, which often is not. And then say you do identify, some skills that you can apply in a context, and AI is actually useful. Then get a team going, reach out to other people in your area or even internationally, because nowadays we're so virtual, and get them involved, and then start to make a timeline, start to organize yourselves and get data and things like that. So actually, the Stanford group has a really good kind of best practices on their website about reaching out to people, how to reach out to people, how to communicate about AI and things like that, and then finally how to deploy the project. Like, they have the whole timeline up there. So I find that that's a good approach to follow in getting involved in AI for good.
Excellent, thank you for that. And although we didn't plan this, it aligns so much to particularly to X Prize's view of the world. And what's very relevant to this is that seeing that same need and the same need to identify other projects that are out there and parties that are doing that are part of these causes and including them. X Prize is actually putting together a global AI alliance, where, much like we did with our pandemic alliance, we're inviting parties who have solutions, who have problems, who know about the problems, to get together and convene around how we can apply AI to them. So I'd love to see how aligned we are, and we'll be talking more about that later. But in the meantime, I do want to thank you so much for your words of inspiration, your patience going through all of these questions. Certainly you had a lot of interest from the audience. So on behalf of everybody on the call, I do thank you for that. And yes, let's pick up the torch where you're leaving it and challenging us here on your presentation. So thanks again.
Thanks for listening.